Today is Wednesday, September 17th, year of our Lord 2025. And we're on day 3 of my official 5 days of hate. Let's continue. All right. Well, if you follow me on X, then you know that I've been posting various verses talking about Christian righteous hatred. And, of course, I understand that many people aren't going to like this, but it's just something that needs to be said, especially in a moment like this. And I was thinking, you may have already seen this on X. I did a few videos about it, but I was thinking about the whole idea of not being able to, as a Christian pastor, I'm not a pastor, but other Christian pastors, not being able to talk about how America needs to rediscover hate. It needs to learn to hate again. Because, you never know, because not everybody in America is regenerate, and so they're going to get all mixed up, and, they're not going to know what to do with that and all this kind of thing. And I think that's, personally, I think on the face of it, that's very stupid. But the reality, though, is that God requires things even of unregenerate people who don't know their right hand from their left. He requires the same standard. The standard is the same whether you have a heart of stone or a heart of flesh. And so as a Christian minister, it is part of your job to tell people what God requires of them. In fact, this is part of our normal training when we're talking about the gospel. You've got to tell them the bad news, right? Before you tell them the good news. And the bad news, of course, is that you do not measure up to what God requires. Here is the list that God requires of you. You don't measure up. But the good news is that God saves sinners, of which you are. But there's still a standard to uphold. And so, one of the good things about Dr. James White, this isn't an episode about Dr. James White, but I do want to mention this. One of the good things about him is that he's very wise and he has a lot of good things to teach. And in fact, he doesn't just tell you what to think, he also helps you on how to think through issues. And he's very good at that. And so I want to give him a lot of props because I paid attention in class. You know what I mean? I paid attention to what he had to say, and so I learned a lot. There's no question about it. And one of the things he often talked about, a lot of times it was in the context of Calvinism and all of this, is in the book of Isaiah, where God is, he's angry with Israel, and he's going to discipline Israel, and he uses the people of Assyria, the Assyrians, to do that, right? He calls Assyria an instrument in his hands, right? But so he does that. That's what he does. It's his prerogative. God does what he wants to do. But in the same prophecy, though, he judges Assyria for doing it, right? And you start to think, well, how can he judge Assyria for doing what he ordained them to do? They were an instrument in his hand. He used them for his purposes, and then he turns around and judges them. Well, yeah, he does. Because he judged them that their hearts weren't right. They were doing it for the wrong reasons. They don't get any props for doing what God ordained them to do with his people, against his people. They don't get any props for that because they were doing it for all the wrong reasons. They were haughty. They were vicious. They were, all of these things. And so he turns around and judges the very instrument that he held in his hand, because they, regardless of their regenerate status, they were clearly non-regenerate, were held to the same standard. And God judges them for that. They did not meet the standard, even as they were an instrument in his hand to discipline Israel. That's a very wise counsel there, of course, because it is very obvious that even unregenerate people are held to God's standards. And so therefore, when we think of the civil governing authority as a deacon of God, an instrument in God's hands, he gives the sword of his vengeance to the civil governing authority. He expects it to be used That doesn't mean they're always going to use it correctly for the right reasons. And so he can judge the civil governing authority even as he uses the civil governing authority as an instrument. And so therefore, it is completely appropriate for someone in a position of a minister in America to demand that the civil governing authority hate what God hates, love what God loves. In fact, there is a verse that I quoted today as part of my 5 days of hate, where this is from Amos, right? This is a prophecy. It says, hate evil, love good, maintain justice in the courts. That's what he requires. That's what he requires from the civil governing authorities, to maintain justice in the courts. Well, how do you do that? Well, the way you do it is you hate evil and love good. And what's at stake in the courts, right? Or do we take the concept of evil to court? Do we try the concept of evil? No. We try people, right? And so in order to maintain justice in the courts, you've got to hate evil people, love good people, and thus maintain justice in the courts. That's what God requires. And so it is right and good and obvious for Joel to say that America needs to learn to hate again. Hate is a non-negotiable. The civil governing authority hates all the time. And the question is, are they going to do it for God, according to God's standards, hate what God hates, love what God loves, or are they going to do it by their own standards? And even if they do it the right way, are they doing it for the right reasons as well? That is required, and it is, of course, within the purview of a minister to demand that happen. America must learn to hate again. That's right. That's right. And Joel was exactly right. I mean, the church has done a job. I'm not going to say a good job, but they've done a job teaching about love over and over and over and over again. And rightfully so, because love, of course, God is love. The law of God is about love. It's the law of love, right? We all understand that. So rightfully so. I'm not saying you shouldn't talk about love. But we have done a very piss poor job teaching about righteous anger, righteous hatred, and those kinds of things. And so this should be obvious to people, but of course, it isn't for various reasons. Now, I think that Dr. White's reasons are very personal and petty, but there are many other ministers out there that maybe don't have the same pettiness that Dr. White expresses daily on X and on his show. But it's still correct, regardless of which way you want to attack it. Now, here's a interesting post that I saw through Jeff Wright from R.M. Hurd of the Davenant Institute. And he's responding to people like me. Now, I don't know that he's seen my stuff, so he's not responding directly to me, but he's responding to people like me, essentially. And what he says here is very interesting. I wanted to give you my commentary about it. So R.M. Hurd has this to say. He says, and by the way, I think this is the standard interpretation for most evangelical leaders. This is the standard way that they see guys like me, right? And so this might be helpful to you as well, because you need to prepare for the onslaught of this kind of thing, especially as you lean into righteous anger and righteous hatred. You're going to hear this kind of presentation all the time, right? All the time. So I want you to see what he has to say, and I'm going to explain to you some of the sleight of hand that he uses as part of this, right? He tries to smuggle in a few assumptions that he doesn't really outright say, but this is kind of implied in what he's saying. So R.M. Hurd says this. He says, I've seen a lot of people in recent days, given extremely sad and deplorable events, argue from certain sayings in the Jewish scriptures. By the way, they're Christian scriptures, by the way. Argue from certain sayings in the Jewish scriptures unto the need for Christian to hate as God hates, or something of this sort. It is important to recall that many of these sayings were originally imprecations addressed to the tribal deity to physically destroy their enemies. Such sayings are only enclosed in Christian canon if they are being interpreted allegorically. For example, as prayers to the Most High that the enemies of the soul would be destroyed, like the devil, the world, and one's own flesh. Or to come at this from another but related angle, the book of Joshua is not a pattern for your politics, much less for oppressing others. It is a highly dramatized movie for you to watch when thinking about the spiritual war which you ought to wage against yourself, fighting under the banner of Jesus. So he wants to make it an allegory, right? The fighting of Israel was an allegory for your fight against sin, which I think is true. That is part of what we read in the Old Testament. But here's the thing, though. If you notice what he says many of these sayings were originally imprecations addressed to the tribal deity, blah, 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 blah. So he says many of them are, which is technically accurate. Many of them are, but not all of them. See, but what he wants the reader to hear when he hears that many of them those are just imprecatory prayers, you know what I mean? Those are imprecations. You know, many of them are, what he wants you to hear is that these are imprecations. They're not to be followed. You're not to get instruction from them. It's not an example for you. It's an imprecation. It's that kind of thing. But they're not all that way, of course. They're not all that way. In fact, the one I just read, the prophecy from Amos, says, hate evil, love good, maintain justice in the courts. Now, this R.M. Hurd would never say that Christians shouldn't seek to maintain justice in the courts, right? And so this is a command. This is a prescription. This is not an imprecation. This is not an imprecation. We are required to demand that our courts, and if you are a member of a court, then you are required to do this. Hate evil, love good, maintain justice in the courts. Remember that it's not just the concept of evil, because courts don't try concepts. Courts are personal. Courts are about people and their activities and their actions and what they do. And so that's the first sleight of hand. He says that many of them are, and he wants you to apply it to the whole, but that's just not the case. In fact, we've got prophecy, like I just showed you from Amos. We've got law. We've got law from the book of the law, and we've got wisdom literature that tell us explicitly that there is a time for everything under the sun. There's a time for hatred as well. There's a time for war as well. And so if we're going to be wise as Solomon is wise, we need to understand that, and we need to reckon with that, and we need to hold it together with all of the commands to love our enemies as well. All of the commands to not seek vengeance for ourselves as well. But we do have to connect that with all of the times in the New Testament where God talks about vengeance that is his, that he actually gives to people. And so that's the first sleight of hand. Many of them are they're just imprecations. They're just imprecations. Well, not all of them are, number one. But here's the other factor as well. He wants to deny you the ability to practice imprecations, imprecatory prayers. Now, I think that, most people, if they grew up the way I did, they didn't hear imprecatory prayers very often in the church. In fact, I can't imagine, I know it's less than 5 times I've ever heard an imprecatory prayer at church. Why is that? Why should we be denied imprecations when there's examples of imprecations from men who are a man after God's own heart? Why is it no longer something that we can practice? Why can't we practice it? Why is it not an example? Why can't we learn from it? Why can't we have those same kinds of emotions? People have said, well, that's just David venting his emotions. So why did we, from David to today, right? King David can vent his emotions to the Lord. Why from there to today do we now have to be like Spock? Because that's the impression that I got. When I was a kid, I used to watch Star Trek, right? And the thought that I had in my mind, the way that it was taught to me, was that a Christian essentially was like Spock. He didn't get too hot. He didn't get too cold, right? Maybe he got cold. Maybe he got sad, right? Because Spock didn't get really sad either. But that was allowed. But when it came to anger and aggression and these kinds of things, we had to turn ourselves into Spock or Data or whoever, whatever generation you watched. Why? He smuggles that in as if it's just an assumption. These imprecations are not appropriate for Christians, but that's not the case. That's not the case. You try praying an imprecatory prayer at church. Try it. Don't try it, by the way. I'm not trying to tell you to cause trouble at church. But if you were to try it, you'd be called into the principal's office immediately. And you'd be told that it's not appropriate. It's not appropriate. When we have the example, these things in the Old Testament, they were written for us, for training, to have an example. It's not just a movie. I mean, the way he presents is just a movie for you to watch, to think about it allegorically. That's not the case. These were real people in real situations, and many of the situations that they found themselves in are directly analogous to situations we find ourselves in today. It is not the case that there's no wars today, that there's no violence against the Lord's people today, that there's no threats to the Lord's people today, that there's no idolatry that the Lord's people must confront today. In 2025, we're fighting the same battles that they were fighting back then. There's nothing new under the sun. That's another wisdom literature that, we can't just allegorize to death. These were real people. They weren't movie characters. I know how you were trained. I was trained the same way. When you hear that Jesus called out in a loud voice, it would be like Spock raising his voice a little bit, just so he could be heard. It wasn't about him being angry. He didn't sound like the crazy street preacher in the town square where, the good Christians go, oh, it shouldn't be that way. God is not angry. No, he had a booming voice. He had emotion. He had aggression when he raised his voice, when he cried out. It wasn't like Spock. You read in the Bible, I remember a very specific situation, and I can't tell you all about it, it's private, but where someone's talking about, Paul and Barnabas when they split up, and that's all you hear in the Bible. They had a disagreement and they split up, right? Think about it. Put flesh and blood on that for a second. Think about how bad the argument must have been for you to split up, to part ways. If you just think and put flesh on it for just a second, you know that they were probably shouting at each other. They were probably pretty angry. They were seeing red. We cannot think of the Christian walk as the walk of essentially a Vulcan, where they suppress their emotions so much and so often from when they were little that by the time they reach adulthood, they don't experience them anymore. That's not how it is. You hear these famous Christian ministers, and they talk about loving your enemies, and the way they talk about it is as if you need to now start conjuring up affections for your enemies. And when you see your enemy, you have to see, it has to be the same way that you see your friends, like you see your wife, like you've got to feel just like these affections towards them. And that's not the case. You're not Spock. You have to treat them a certain way. We have to rediscover this stuff, my friends. We just have to. And they're going to come at you and they're going to say, well, you're not David. This is just the high IQ, PhD style of saying we're not David. Matt Chandler gets ripped these days about that "you're not David" sermon, and rightfully so. I mean, that's not correct. The way he presented that's not correct. And from what I understand, he walked that back because he knew that wasn't correct, right? But I'm telling you, even the people that rip him for it and they get their robes on, he wasn't quite right about that. Most of them still operate as if that is correct. You're not David. Who do you think you are? You think you're Jesus? You see Jesus flip the tables. You think you're Jesus? No, we don't think we're Jesus. But we also don't chop Jesus up into different pieces like a buffet and take the stuff that we're comfortable with, that we've heard our whole lives, and then throw the other stuff away. We don't like that stuff. We actually want to follow Jesus as he really is. As he really is. You want to know how Jesus is? You want to know what he's like? You need to read the whole Bible. You need to read the whole Bible. This is one way to try to inoculate yourself from the tsunami of well-meaning, pietistic, but ultimately just mistaken believers. You got to remember these three things and meditate on what this actually means, because I've done this. I did this a long time ago, and I'm not perfect, obviously. Obviously, I'm not perfect. But this will help you. You got to remember these three things. The Son of God does not contradict himself. It's impossible. He does not contradict himself. You can't have a Son of God that's divided against himself. So what he said, he can't then say something opposite. He says the same thing. He might expand on it. He might correct on it. He might nuance what he said to help you understand, but he's not contradicting himself. That's number one. Get that through your skull. Meditate on that all the time. The Son of God cannot contradict himself. Number two, the same Son of God. The Son of God is the God of Israel, the same God of Israel that you read about in the Old Testament story. It's not a movie, it's history. In the Old Testament, you read about the people of Israel and their God, the God that they follow, the God that saves them, the God that fights for them, the God that disciplines them, that same God, the God who gave them the law. That is the same Son of God that does not contradict himself. This will be a hard one for so many of you because I was trained the same way you were trained. I know how you were trained. This will be a hard one to swallow. But the same Son of God is the God of Israel that you read about in the Old Testament. That book of history, that's the same Son of God. And here's the third one. Obvious for most Christians. This one won't be hard to believe, but it'll be hard for a lot of people to hold this together. The Son of God came down from heaven, and by the Holy Spirit, he was incarnate of the Virgin Mary and became man. Jesus, the Christ, that is the same Son of God. The same Son of God that is the God of Israel, the same Son of God that cannot contradict himself. It's not just that he does not contradict himself, he cannot contradict himself. You have to hold all of those together. And so as we said yesterday, the same Son of God that said, your eye shall not pity, is the same Son of God that said, you shall love your enemy. And you have to hold those together. And you have to figure out how to hold those together. And it's not that complicated. When God tells you not to hate your enemy, not to avenge yourself, he's talking about a very particular set of circumstances. When you're a civil governing authority, when you're a judge, and he says to you, your eye shall not pity, execute vengeance upon the evildoer, those things don't contradict. Those things don't contradict. You've got to do this work. You've got to do this work. It's just like before with the original woke wars. I know how you were trained. You're not crazy, and you've got to take all of what God says, and you've got to understand it in the right kind of a way, and you've got to hold it all together. It's very good and right that many people say that talk about the Old Testament as if it's, Jesus is the center, the Son of God is the center of it. That's very true, and that's very good. But that has to have implications for your understanding of it all. It's not enough to just say, "Oh, it's a story of Jesus. It's supposed to point us to Christ." That is all true. But you have to also now understand the law. You have to understand the prophecy. You need to understand the imprecations. You need to understand the wisdom literature in a way that does not make Jesus contradict himself as the Son of God. You can't do it. You can't allow that to happen. And this is complicated, and you might not get it right all the time, but there's got to be room for this. There's got to be a place for this. And I am not one to tell you whether to leave your church or not. I'm never going to do that. Well, maybe I have in the past. I don't know. But I'm not going to do that today. But you must have pastors that are willing to walk with you as you start to figure out how to do this, right? You have to, because you need help. You can't do it on your own. You can't do it on your own. But if a pastor's not willing to walk with you to figure out how do I understand these verses that in a way that does not make the Son of God contradict himself. The famous one that I think is such a blessing because it's so like in your face, like it feels like a contradiction. But again, you can't allow that to happen. The Son of God cannot contradict himself. Where Jesus says, "You have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you," that one is such a gift for us. Because in order for us to hold it together, now we have to reckon with something that really kind of tests us a little bit. What are we going to believe about the law, the Son of God, the God of Israel? What are we going to believe about that God who is there, who is the Son of God, who's now saying this to us? What are we going to believe? And a lot of people just give up. They say, "Well, he changed the law." Well, he changed the law. They gave up at that point. They're giving it up. You can't do it. You can't do it. Especially if you're a Reformed. I mean, the Reformed tradition is clear on this. The eye for an eye, the tooth for a tooth, that's still the standard. That is still the standard. You have to hold that together with what Jesus says there. In any case, guys, I hope that this was encouraging to you. I hope that you get something out of this. I hope that it steels your spine just a little bit to believe what we've believed for generations at this point, and to not allow this kind of a presentation to make you feel like, I don't know, like you're some kind of sub-Christian or something like that. Like, just don't do it. Just don't do it. In any case, God bless you. Hope you found it helpful. God bless.